Good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of On the Couch with Creatives, the podcast for creative professionals everywhere. As we've said before, we're part of the Creatives Group, which is a private networking group for creative professionals who want to connect, create, grow and develop their creative businesses. And without further ado, Julie, who is our guest today?
Well, joining us today is voice coach Donald Woodburn, who is in Sydney, in Australia. He runs Woodburn Voice, is a director at BrandU Media, and is on the board of something called Feet First Collective, which I'm sure he's going to tell us all about. Well, I know Donald from when we were both working at the SABC in Johannesburg many years ago. The SABC is South Africa's national broadcaster, and Donald was voice coaching and I was presenting. Donald has headed the voice departments at the AFDA Film and TV School in Johannesburg and at the Western Australia Academy of Performing Arts in Perth.
Yeah, and he's got quite a CV, really, hasn't he, Julie? He's also worked for AlJazeera English and MTVbase in South Africa for SABC and ETV, which is now eNCA. I hope I've said that correctly. And also in Australia with Fox Sports and Fox Sports News, ABC, Channels 7 and 9, among others. So we've got quite a superstar in our midst, haven't we, Julie?
We do.
Oh, always a superstar, yes.
I love it. Into voice coaching, Donald.
Julie, I don't even know if I've ever told you the story, because it's actually quite a fun story. I studied at WITS. I did the acting, well, it was the drama course at WITS, but I did acting and television production as my majors in 3rd and 4th year. And then I graduated. And, you know, suddenly you're out in the world and you've got to do things. And at that stage, because that was 1994, so a pretty historic year in South Africa. And suddenly there I was in a modern democracy, well, not quite a democracy at that early stage of 94. But I don't know whether you know the Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal, which was known as PACT at that stage. I don't know what it is or isn't now. But at that stage, they were based in Pretoria. And then they had a kind of, I'll probably get sued for saying this, a lesser body or whatever it was in Johannesburg. At that stage, they were beginning to explore the idea of how do we deal with the new democracy and a new reality in South Africa. So at the Windy Brow in Hillbrow, there was the other wing of of PACT, and that was basically run by Walter, and Walter was running Chauke, I think his surname was. I hope I got that right. And Walter, so basically it was at that stage what one would now call the black wing of PACT, and I got to be the token white male that worked on and off in that theatre company over 2 years. But it was myself and Winnie Stratum who ended up working in Vetkoek Palace and after that in Gautengeling. So it was her and I were the two kind of token white faces in that company. And so really I got on stage every night and my voice just was not holding a room like everybody else in the company was holding the room. And at that point I was like, okay, you need to work out what's going on here and fix it, because if you want to have a career as an actor, you need to sort this out. So that was sort of how I came to voice. And then I started looking around to see how I could deal with that. And at that stage, I basically, if I'd wanted to go and study abroad, because there was nowhere, well, I didn't really think there was anywhere in South Africa, probably University of Pretoria, I think at that stage was beginning to go in that direction, but I obviously did my research like I went abroad rather than thinking internally. And the 3 places I could study was either in New York, London or Sydney. And in 1990, that would have been 94, 95. So 95 going to 1996, in terms of the exchange rates, it really was Australia's exchange rate was 2.7 to the rand. It's now 10 to the rand. Can you believe it? But at that stage, it was 2.7. And I think the American dollar was about 7 and the British pound was about 12. So in pure like economic terms, it was either, and they were all roughly charging 10 to 12,000 of their own currency that year. So it was either, 28, 78 or 120 of South African rands. So the obvious option was Australia. And so I went and I flew to Australia in 95, auditioned to get into NIDA, got into the voice studies program. And that's how I ended up in the field of voice. And I went, although the course that I was doing was ready to teach voice, I thought, well, if I can teach it, I can teach myself. And so that was the entire kind of drive behind what I ended up doing. And of course, that was also then my introduction to Australia and what do you do, why, anyway, it was just, suddenly Australia was a part of the fabric of who I was because of that. And then, but by the end of that year, I went back to South Africa. I was offered a job at AFDA by Dion Opperman. I think it was about September, October of 1996. And so I was back in South Africa teaching in 1997, and AFDA was right next door to the SABC. And so that became the kind of, I basically bounced between the two buildings pretty much from pretty early on in 1997.
Fantastic. And we've been obviously researching you, and you are known as the originator of something called voice targeting, are you not, Donald? What does that mean exactly, and what does it entail?
Oh, again, a nice, long, interesting story. The originator in that, I think some really interesting stories when you begin to unpack or unpick things. So basically, when I got to the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts in 2010 and started teaching, within the first week or two of being there, one of the second-year actors said to me, "Donald, you're teaching targeting." I was like, "What do you mean I'm teaching targeting? I'm just teaching what Donald Woodburn teaches." So they were like, no, you're teaching targeting. So I rushed out that evening and bought the book written by Declan Donnellan of the United Kingdom and read it. And I went, yeah, that's sort of my approach to what I'm teaching voice-wise. There's so many principles that are similar. And then I kind of looked back at what had happened. So if I can kind of make a bit of sense of it, because I think it's more interesting. When I started working at the SABC, I was working with quite a lot of journos who were, so they got sent out in a story to cover a political rally in one of the cities or towns in South Africa. And suddenly there was a shooting at the rally, or something happened at that rally. There'd be, right in those days, that would have been 97, 98, 99, there were live crossings. And that was early on, Julie, you'll probably remember that. Like that would have been when the live crossings really started to happen, because everyone suddenly had mobile phones or cell phones, whatever you call them. And so there were these people telling stories live that were genuinely exciting. And that would be at, say, 11 or 12 in the morning. And then the news would go out, and the SABC went from an 8 p.m. to a 7 p.m. primary bulletin, somewhere around at that period of time. But the package that went out that night from that journalist would then go out at 7 or 8 p.m. And almost inevitably, their voices would not sound as exciting or dynamic as they did during the live crossings. So I started literally going, it would have been 97, because I began teaching that into the acting course pretty quickly after realizing what was going on. I went, what's actually happening here? And I analyzed what was happening in the live crossings. And I wrote down like 20, 30, 40 lines, whatever, of what I thought was going on with the human voice. And then I listened to the package and I wrote down everything that I could list underneath what I thought was going on with the human voice in the package. So in other words, sitting in a voice booth doing the recording. And I was like, what's different? What's this voice doing? What's it referring to? Who's this person talking to? Who do they perceive the audience to be? So I just started unpacking it on every single level. And so to come back to your question, what's vocal targeting? I started going, oh, okay. Like, I need to break this down for the person I'm training to go, in this moment, the person you are talking to, and this is way back in 1997, the person you're talking to is your vocal target. And the thing you are talking about is your vocal reference. So, and we constantly move the voice between the vocal reference and the vocal target, or the vocal target and the vocal reference, because we're trying to show the person we're talking to, we're engaging the person we're talking to with the thing that we're talking about. So the voice, almost like a laser pointer for me, moves continuously between those 2 points in real life. So if you go into a studio and you're sitting with walls and nothing's giving you any information, and what's in front of you is what you're reading, your voice is going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, not terribly interesting. If you're out in the field talking about a bullet that's been shot over there and someone, the ambulance is over here, the voice is suddenly 10 times more interesting because it's referencing the real world rather than referencing the page in front of you. So really the fundamentals of my work began in terms of unpicking what that was about and saying to someone, when you go into that studio and you start recording your voice, I still need your voice to know where's the microphone, and the microphone represents an ear. Who are you talking to and what are you talking about? And the voice must move continuously between those two things. And I was calling that vocal targeting, because I was going, this is your vocal target. What's your voice targeting in every moment? So then when I read Declan Donlan's book, that would have been 2010. So 13 years after I was more or less teaching this, I read this book called Targeting the Actor and the Voice. Sorry, what was it called? The Actor and the Target. And there I'm reading it going, yes, this, like, we're talking about the same thing. He's talking about it in acting terms. I'm talking about it in voice terms. So it was a big tick confirmation to me from a major director that what I was onto was worth really kind of digging down deeper and continuing my research into. So that's how I would describe vocal targeting. And in actual fact, interestingly, I think one of the things that I mean, this is slightly controversial, but controversial is always good. My whole life, having obviously studied acting, everyone always talks about iambic pentameter when it comes to Shakespeare, which is ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. And I was like, well, really, isn't that just the voice going from the vocal target to the vocal reference, to the vocal target to the vocal reference, as we continuously move between those two things? So isn't that really the rhythm of speech rather than actually, I mean, obviously you can measure whether or not someone's getting that right in the rhythm of their writing or in the poet, in the poetry. But ultimately, I personally believe that that's a rhythm of speech related to the voice, and I call it the laser point of voice moving between the ear and the reference, the ear and the reference, the ear and the reference. And I think that leads to the rhythm of speech. So
and surely voice coaching is different with actors as opposed to journalists, or is it the same technique that you use?
Really, I don't think there's a difference between an actor or a politician, a journalist or a business person. At the end of the day, there's an audience. Let's flip that on its head, because one of the things that I teach quite extensively is the rules of listening. So we get born, we learn to speak from our parents and from our community around us. Our ears and our brains, the way our brains receive information, is programmed by how we have listened over the years. So rather than the rules of speaking, I'm interested in what are the rules of listening. And in actual fact, so are the ratings, because as soon as someone stops listening because they're changing the channel or they've flicked off whatever it is they're watching, it's, in my opinion, obviously sometimes it's because the information's not interesting enough. But if you break the rules of speaking for long enough, the rules of listening for long enough with the way you are speaking, that listening ear starts going, what's in the washing machine? Did I leave the heater on downstairs? Because it's not being fed information the way it's used to receiving information. So for me, I think really and truly too many people break the rules in broadcasting, in public speaking, because they're not going, what's the ear actually expecting to hear? So in all my work, as soon as my ear stops listening, I'm going, what's that person doing wrong? Because something's happened in this moment. And to identify that, whether it's cultural, or are they standing up straight and therefore their body isn't able to move relative to what they're talking about, or are they just barking forwards at something all the time so the voice isn't doing all that measuring? Really and truly, that's what it's about, for me anyway. And that's my skill set, I think. So yeah, I think we listen to politicians more when when you hear someone actually talking about the problem in the community, then talking forward at the camera about their self-importance. You know, it's like at every level, if you're a business person standing up, talking to a company about profits or potential growth areas in your company, your voice had better be actually referring to the real world like it does in real life, or who the hell is going to listen to you. And also, you can't talk to a room full of people. We are always talking to one person at a time.
Yeah.
And so even if there are 10 people, you think about a dinner party that you go to and you're telling I won't swear, a fabulous story about something, and someone catches your eye over there who's laughing at what you've said. For the next like 2 to 3 bits of really useful information, you focus on them, and then you turn to the person on this side and you hold their attention for a second. So while you tell the entire dinner party your amazing story, you really are connecting with who's listening to you in any moment. So for me, vocal dynamic, which is a kind of a word to describe, or your vocal focus, is constantly shifting between person and subject, person and subject. And the person can also change depending on who's in front of you. The more that changes, the more interesting every single moment of what you're doing is, because the voice is no longer barreling down towards the microphone.
I think that's really interesting, really, really interesting, because I coach in video production. That's my business, and I coach businesses in how to communicate their stories really, really well. And the one thing, as I say, I'm not a vocal coach, but the one thing that I always beat my clients with is it's not about you and your story. It's about what the viewer sees and hears. You know, you're talking to them, they have to relate to it. So that ties in very well with what you've just been saying. It's not somebody just getting up and talking and say, my business is wonderful, or I'm wonderful. It's how are you putting that across so that you're really talking to the listener, so that they're going to engage with you and go on that journey with you.
And also acknowledging with your listener that what you're talking about is the same thing that they're thinking about, rather than imposing something on them, because none of us are stupid. I mean, we can all have various levels of intellectual capacity, but we've all lived on the planet. We all know what a rhino is. We all know what a hurricane is. We all know what, you know, we know what hail and sun are. So I don't need to be educated on that. Someone just needs to tell me about the fact that today was the hottest day in recorded history. And I go, yeah, no, I was outside, it was bloody awful, rather than being educated on what was going on. So there's this incredible thing about engaging with it's engaging with truth, really, at the end of the day, rather than engaging with marketing. And I think the more we engage with truth and the less we engage with marketing or selling. So to some extent, Julie, I think one of the major problems of news bulletins is always trying to sell me the news. Well, I'm going, well, if you're having to sell me the news, it's not newsworthy. Really and truly, if something is genuinely newsworthy, so if we go to something as like devastating or enormous, really, as the death of Diana, if you watched all those bulletins on that day, no one was selling that story. They were talking about that story. And in that moment, there's something, the tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, same thing. You didn't have to tell me about how shocking the wave was. The wave was shocking. So it's kind of living in relationship to your subject. So if you're having to amp it up, there's a problem. You're choosing the wrong subject. And
but you do have to amp it up. If you say, for argument's sake, you're in the middle of a disaster area like you described, and you're excited and this is all happening around me, and then you go back to the studio and you put a package together, and you literally in a sound booth with a microphone, you do have to amp it up to keep that same level of energy in the voice going through the package.
My question is, do you have to amp it up, or do you have to actually deal with the truth of it? So if somebody talks to me about 1994 in South Africa, I don't have to amp it up. I just have to remember what that entire experience was like. That period from 1990 to 1994 continues to define me as a human being, because there was a moment in my life where it was the realization of what was wrong with, I mean, obviously I'd realized before that, but I was only 18 in 1990. So to grow up and to turn into an adult and to kind of encounter the truth of my history and where I was living, that none of that was small or insignificant. So if I talk about it, all I need to actually do is talk about the genuine value of that issue. If I have to tell people the value of that issue, it kind of diminishes it rather than me standing or living in it. So do you amp it up, or do you just take yourself back?
Well, maybe amping it up is the wrong word then, because that sounds as though you artificially have to put some energy into your voice. So obviously with this vocal targeting, you need to bring your emotion out naturally.
Well, I think if you read Declan Donnellan's book, what he's saying is if you're talking about the right thing, you naturally have that response to what you're talking about. So if you choose the thing that genuinely stimulates you, you think about any story. Julie, I mean, I don't know things like all the things that have happened in your life, but if you're chased by an elephant while you're out walking in the Kruger National Park, you retell people that story. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 year, 5 years.
But they don't believe me.
Well, yes, but the moment you tell them that story, you remember the elephant chasing you, and everything about that moment gets back to the level that it should be at. So if you're choosing the right element of the story to talk about, your energy levels should go back, should really kick in to what's happening. So it's really that's what Declan Donnellan's saying in his book. I mean, he's saying 100 things in his book, so let me not diminish what he's saying. But at the crux of what it is that really it's not how we feel, it's how we respond to the real world. And that was what struck me working with journalists. When they're out there and someone is shooting at them and they have to hide underneath a car so that they don't get shot by a sniper or whatever, and they live on television saying someone is shooting in our car right now, they don't need to pretend that's exciting. If they talk about that a year later and go, it was the most terrifying day of my life, being underneath that car being shot at. If they say that without energy in their voice, they probably need to see a therapist, because they've missed that they are no longer talking about the full value of what it is that's happening to them. So for me, it's about surrendering as a person to the things in the world that matter to you. And the more you surrender to that, the more there is a vocal dynamic, and the more that your voice is then not you just surrender to what you're talking about, but your voice is also talking about the subject matter. And to the person you're talking to, so already there's this three-way relationship between you, the person you're talking to, and the subject matter continuously operating. There's this extraordinary vocal dynamic that comes into it. And I think if we take a look at what's happened in news over the years, I mean, I remember when CNN was as bold as to kind of, they decided to do a hologram. They laid everything out on the stage so that in the studio, so you could walk into it and there were tanks and that basically we're talking about war zones in a very real way. I thought it was, from a vocal point of view, a really useful thing, because it got the person talking about stuff dynamically. Obviously, everyone was saying, how dare you reduce the loss of human life to this tiny little layout that you've got in your set here. But the fundamental idea of that was not in and of itself problematic. And then I think they, if I'm not mistaken, I stand to be corrected, but they then started using holograms on stage, on the set while they were talking about it. Something would appear and they'd talk about it was like it was right there. And again, people were a little bit upset about that because it was kind of diminishing it. Well, personally, I think that made it, put them into relationship with it. And that's the big issue in the news world, is between the idea of being objective, which is a lie because there's no such thing, and so all you can be is incredibly well researched and honest about your understanding of it. But if you're talking about your understanding of it, it is in and of itself subjective because it is your understanding of it. So I think there's that kind of issue that plays itself out in the news realm, which is around, am I presenting the truth? Because there is no such thing as one truth, and whose truth is it anyway? But so there's all those issues at play. But I think when it becomes about the situation, the objects, that's, who I'm talking to, that starts to create all sorts of vocal dynamics that are really profound and exciting. And when you watch people, like, you'll see it with a politician who finds themselves in trouble. They suddenly start, like, they get more interesting in interviews, or a politician who's absolutely like smashed something brilliantly and they're talking about it. That confidence and the truth of what they're talking about is more exciting. But as soon as you hear them doing spin, you go, yeah, you're no longer talking about the real world. You're trotting out something that someone at the office told you to say. And so the vocal referencing gets really boring, because it's actually telling me about Joe Bloggs back there who told me to say this, rather than what you're actually talking about.
Yeah.
So do you also coach businessmen and politicians not just actors and journalists?
I do. I work across all those areas, and I find them, in actual fact, Julie, I find it really exciting, because if you just work in the acting realm all the time, you just meet one kind of personality type. I mean, that sounds terrible. You meet someone with a particular passion. And when you meet a journalist, they've got a different kind of passion. Something else drives them. They have a different, so for me, working in those different realms is exciting, because when the person walks into the room, they bring something different into the room. So for me, same material, different context. And and so I get an enormous buzz. I get an enormous buzz out of doing that. And that's really, so the more variety I can work with, the more excited I get. But yes, I do. And when I'm working with them, it's really about, who are you? What are you about? Who you're talking to? And what are you talking about? If it's about what's written on the page, we're in trouble. If it's about what's happening in the world, we're moving somewhere. We're starting to get it right.
That's the thing I was just going to say, is it's that human connection, isn't it? It's the connection with emotion. If you're talking about something that you care about, or you're passionate about, or you are connected to, then it's going to have a very, very different impact than you say just trying to be rehearsed and reading something from a sheet that somebody's told you to say, that actually you're saying it because you have to, rather than feeling that thing.
And even on the feeling that thing, I would take it to knowing that thing, because if you know it, you're acknowledging the mental kind of awareness of it. You sort of know it physically, you know what its relationship to your body is, you know it emotionally. So for me, the more you know what you're talking about, the more connected you are to all those aspects, the more you acknowledge the room you're in, so you know your crowd, that the easier it is to play your crowd. So in many instances, it's about knowing. So it's about your truth, but that truth is multifaceted rather than one-dimensional. And that, so I mean, going back to some of the things I've said about myself, I see myself as the anti-voice coach rather than the voice coach, because really I don't focus on the voice per se. My ear is good with the voice, my understanding of the voice is good, but if you fix all those other things around the voice, usually the voice begins to come out anyway. So there's an enormous sense of, I up the ante in terms of what I expect you to do, but I'm not expecting you to do it vocally. I'm actually expecting you to do it in terms of communication and relationship and all those things, which is much more interesting for me, you know, and each of us leans one way or another. Some of us are all about the story. Some of us are all about the audience. Some of us are all about ourselves. And if it's all about you, then we need to make that interesting, because if I ask you to make it about the other thing, that's not going to fit your personality type anymore. That's going to disconnect you from your voice. So it's also about that variety of what's actually going on in the communication moment, and serving every client that you work with. It's sussing them out and making sure that you really are giving us a bespoke bit of training to the person that you're talking to, which I suppose in some ways, Julie, if I take you back to when I started working at the SABC, I mean, I won't say a particular person's name, but one of the journos that I was working with, he was, you know, he kept kind of, whenever he was an African language speaker, and every time he shifted to English, his voice went right up in pitch, and he started doing something really weird, speaking English, that he wasn't doing when I heard him speaking to his colleagues in his language area. And I was like, okay, what's he doing? And at one point I just went, you know, who's your audience? And just shifting who he was talking to, who he perceived to be on the other side of the television. And all of those things went click, 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 click. And that had nothing to do with his body. It had to do just to do with who's listening. And in every single instance, there's an incredibly potent space to investigate. So it's everything. It's like your subject matter, your audience, yourself, the context, potency, all those things are having such a gigantic impact on every single moment. And the more you engage with that, the kind of bigger and bolder that gets, really.
Well, you obviously have a very different take on voice coaching, and you're writing a book about it, right?
Well, 300 pages so far, Julie. However, what I teach people about the voice, which is how to get themselves out the way, is what someone needs to teach me when I'm writing. Get yourself out the way, Donald. I just, you know, when it comes to writing, that kind of academic thing, having been to university, it creeps in. And while I'm typing away, some other voice manages to layer itself on top of what I'm writing. So there's 300 pages of quite really rather exciting information. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of what I've written. It sort of feels a bit like my anti-voice manifesto, but it needs a slapping. It needs a good putting into place. It needs to be told what to do with itself. So I reckon we need to take it down to about 250 pages, and it needs a major reordering. Interestingly, when I wrote it, all I did was every time something popped up, I went, I'm just going to write that down quickly. And it started during COVID. It was like during lockdowns, I'd just write a paragraph about something. And then the next time something popped in my head, I just wrote a paragraph about it. And suddenly there were 300 pages of paragraphs. And so what I did at that point was I went through and reread it and gave every single paragraph a heading, depending on what element or aspect of voice I thought it was talking about, printed them out. And then we went to the manual, because my brain still likes to work with real things rather than the digital world, cut every paragraph out into its own little paragraph, and then put them all in a pile and pick them up one by one and put them into various piles. I was staying with friends who looked after me through COVID. They invited me up into the foothills of the Blue Mountains, and they were on a beautiful small holding, and I had access to a pool table, and I just laid it all out on this pool table. And suddenly there were 39 piles of things that all kind of sat in the same area. And then I roughly chucked that into an order and then did a digital edit of that. And really and truly what I'm left with is the process of having to really reorder that. And then once I've reordered it, to go through it with a slasher and take out anything that really is repetitive, and to re-explain in areas where I've just spoken like everyone should know what I'm talking about, and to kind of detail that out a little bit more. So I've got to probably chop back about, as I said, about 40 pages, and maybe add about 10 in terms of expanding on some of the ideas. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff in there.
So this is obviously for adults, and it's about your area of business, but you've also created some children's books as well, haven't you? So can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's obviously going to be very different writing for children as opposed to writing for adults. What are your children's books about?
Again, a really intriguing discovery in my life. Judy was probably at a party I went to. It was a friend of ours who's unfortunately no longer with us. And I was at her 50th birthday, and I ended up having a dreadful argument with somebody who was a foreigner who had moved to South Africa from Europe. And they were talking about people changing their voices to fit in. And I remember losing my cool. And I went home that night afterwards, and my brain was just like firing on all cylinders. It was furious. I was like, how am I going to get people to realize that we actually already have a voice? We don't have to conform to somebody else's notion of how we should sound. And I got up the next day, and I am a mad keen gardener. I haven't had a garden since I got to Australia 13 years ago, but I'm passionate gardener. And I went out into my garden the next day, and I was working on it and pruning and cutting and chopping and taking all my frustration out on it. And my garden was like a jungle, so there was always something to prune and cut. And suddenly there was a story in my head that was kind of going round and round and round. And I thought, oh, just ignore it, Donald. Every time you try to write something for theatre, you get half a page in and it's a waste of time and you chuck it away. And so, but it wouldn't go away. So eventually I thought, okay, go and type it into the computer and get it over and done with. You'll waste your time, but you'll get it back out to you and it'll be like it's finished. And suddenly there was a story. There was a whole story written. And as I wrote it, I hadn't planned any particular style of writing, but it came out as a children's story. And I haven't published that one and probably won't ever, but it was called The Boy Who Sounded Different. And so obviously my children's stories came out of the same place that my voice training passion comes from. And that just kind of kept unraveling. And once I'd done that, the next one and the next one and the next one happened. And within a space of about 6 to 9 months, I'd probably written about 20 things that were in some way or another, with the exception of he sneezed on me, related to self-expression, self-worth, diversity, multiculturalism. All those things were sort of embedded in my work. And they came out as children's stories. I never intended to write a children's story in my life.
Show them to us. Show them to us.
Well, this is not the order that I wrote them in, but it's the order that I published them in. Oh, how do I do this so it's not backgrounding weirdly? There we go.
Yeah.
This one's called All the People of the World, which was the first one that I published, which was really about a diversity just accept, pretty much based on my visual aesthetic on that was to go and look at all the street art in South Africa and go, what does South Africa look like through the eyes through the eyes of the people that live here? And that was what emerged. That resulted in, how do I get this to not blur?
Hold it against your body, because you're pushing it up into the blurred area.
Oh, there we go. Tandy counts to 10, which is basically a little counting story. My mother challenged me to write a counting story. She said, oh, it's all good and well that you can write what you feel, but could you do something if somebody made you do it? So I was like, well, tell me what to do. And she said, write a counting story. And so Tandy Counts to 10 was born. And I think, again, just to put it in perspective, I mean, I just love that. That's Tandy's mother and father. So very much a 1995 child, which, is all about diversity and multiculturalism. And so that was that. Then after that, I was like, okay, enough of the politics, Donald, let's do something interesting. I mean, as an outside of the realm of day-to-day life in South Africa, which is always inherently political, which then became He Sneezed on Me, which I wrote. And
this is all about snot, right?
All about snot from beginning to end.
Bodily fluids flying everywhere.
Well, basically, yes, let's keep it to snot. And it was, I mean, I just love how it ended up, it's this, oh, why can't, it just does not like me doing this. So basically that's a monster sneezing all over the little boy. And that was, I was looking after a friend's cats, and they were moving house, and they had nowhere for their cats to stay, and their cats had feline AIDS and were really unwell, and they sneezed all over my house and all over me all the time. And so that was, I remember one day looking down at one of them sneezed on me, and I said, you sneezed on me. And I was like, all over me. And I had it all over my glass. It was everywhere. And that led to He Sneezed on Me. After that was Palace Malice, which was really and truly just about excess and wealth, and the kind of, and again, obviously a Joburg thing, just seeing that inequity of wealth in the city between those that had and those that didn't. And it really was just about a person running around showing off their wealth. And I don't know why it had to be a woman. It just turned out, I mean, I just thought she was more interesting in her wealth than everybody else was. And then I wrote a story which I can't show you, called The Old Man Who Lived on the Hill, which was really just, again, a celebration of, for me, having grown up in rural South Africa, of the humble huts. And where I grew up, they were always painted a light yellow or a light green or a light purple, but some not. And so it was really about a man who woke up one morning and looked at his hut and went, I need to do something to make this pretty. And he goes from being in sepias and all these dull colors, for want of a better word, into turning his life into a life of color. And it's the painting of the house, and there's an amazing book in South Africa called Shack Chic. Julie, I don't know whether you ever saw it.
No.
Which is basically interiors from squatter camps, the shacks and squatter camps. And they have these extraordinary interiors, like breathtaking. And so I've always had this kind of real passion for that aesthetic, because I grew up with it around me, really. And so the book is really the coming to that, and then making everything out of beads and wood. So by the end of the story, there's this person living a very colorful and full artistic life, rather, you know, not just being a kind of subsistence farmer. But it was fully designed and done and ready to go to print, and then I left South Africa and it just never happened, which is a bit sad. And then once I'd left South Africa to go to Australia, Doozy Publishing, which is Shooter and Shooter, they contacted me to do this, and this story came out of that. I love my life, I love me. And it, again, you know, in my mind, it was going to be a book about just different children from different backgrounds celebrating being who they are. That's not, I mean, once you sign over a book to someone, you no longer have any power over what happens unless you're super incredibly important. And so clearly I'm not. So I had no say over what happened to it. But it's a very beautiful little book about celebrating the things we do. And its message is really simple. It's like the whole way through the book, it's actually, I like the way that I look. I like the way that I speak. I like the way that I sing. I like the way that I beat a drum. And all of those things go all the way through the book. And by the end of the book, it's like, hang on, hold, you know, it's like, what does he say? He goes, but hey, hang on, stop. I want to say, I don't just like the way I am. I love my life and who I am. And it was really just about, I wanted the very first page in that book, if I'd had my way, I mean, I ended up changing it for this particular publication, but the very first page was supposed to be, I like the way that I look, stick my picture in this book. And so on the first page was going to be a picture of your child, or of the child that's been given to stuck in the book. And then all the other pictures were going to be of other children doing different things, so the child could realize they were one of many and valued in that context. And all of that comes back down to the philosophy in my voice work, which is like, if you change how you speak to make somebody else happy, you might make that other person happy, but everyone that you sounded like, you make unhappy. And I think there's something profound in that. It's like, to abandon your community to adopt something else is to say to the community that you've abandoned, you weren't good enough. You weren't good enough for me. I need to sound like this to be important. And that's probably underneath all of my work. It's like, go back to yourself first, fall in love with your idiolect, then your dialect, then your accent. And once you can own that in its entirety, by all means, as an artist, play with what you've got. But when it comes to listening, whenever I listen to songs, that song, I would walk 500 miles, just listening to that sung proudly in that Scottish accent, I'm going, yes, you haven't shifted to an American accent. You haven't given up who you are to sing that song. You've sung the song with all the energy of a Scotsman singing that song. Why are the rest of us giving that kind of inherent energy of ourselves up in order to satisfy someone else's need of us? And quite frankly, if you have to speak nicely to be accepted, the people you have to speak nicely for to be accepted, they're never going to accept you anyway. No matter how nicely you speak, you'll never be one of them. They'll give you a tick, but you're not going to be invited.
Oh, I was going to ask you about your top tips. Yeah, go ahead.
Cup of Fortnum and Mason tea, by the way. Not that we're supposed to be punting anything, but it's my favorite cup of tea.
There are other brands available. Yeah.
There we go. It just is that their house blend, Fort Mason, is my favorite tea on the planet. Anyway, I just cannot get enough of it. My top tips, what are my top tips? My top tips are, as I've just said, get to know your voice, the truth of your voice, before you begin to muck with it. So that you can own it. Every change you make, be prepared to make that change. Don't give it up because you think the way you speak is not good enough. Give it up because, make sure you give it up for a very good reason. First tip, preferably don't give it up. Second tip, excuse me, speak. I have two things that I say that I think are really, really important. Speak from the body that you are already in with the breath that you've already got. When people say take a breath to speak, I'm going, what you've done is you're now talking about the breath you've taken instead of the subject you're talking about. So my second tip is speak from the body you are already in with the breath that you've already got. The third one is speaking is something we do while doing something else. So it's not something we do instead of doing something else. It's something we do while doing something else. So I suppose those two end up being tips around every time you sit up straight or do any of these weird things that we think we're supposed to do, we create a tension in the body that doesn't exist in the body in normal conversation. So you can't expect people to hear you sounding normal if you are doing something slightly abnormal in the moment of speaking. The rules of listening, as I mentioned much earlier in the interview, are way more interesting to me than the rules of speaking. Reclaim the language.
What about tips for voice coaches? Because you're talking about tips for people who want to, evolve their voice.
My main tip is stop teaching aesthetics. Start teaching the human voice. Aesthetics, the range of what's acceptable and not acceptable is huge. It's like, stop telling people. I hear women often trying to make their voices sound fuller and fuller in that sense of down here, rather than speaking with the whole voice. So it's like at every moment, ask yourself, okay, this is really useful. What do we sound like when we are pissed? What do we sound like when we are unbelievably tired? What do we sound like when we don't give a shit anymore and we've lost our cool? Because really and truly our voice, our true voice sits in that realm. So to any voice coach out there teaching, if you're teaching anything that's taking us away from that, which is our animal voice really, what are you teaching? Because all you're doing, every single bit that you take us away from that place, you are taking us away from sounding like us. Mm. And each of those disconnections resonate with the listening ear. You phone your best friend and they go, hey, Julie, how are you? And you go, yeah, no, I'm really well. They go, what's wrong, Julie? Because you're lying about something and they know it that quickly. Don't teach people to lie. Teach people to tell the truth, really, is my, and who we are, the truth of the size of my larynx, the shape of my body, the expressivity of who I am as a person. All those things are who I am. And when we begin to embrace them, the platform that we begin to learn from, or that we begin to explore from, is embedded in the self, which is a much more powerful place to grow from than trying to sound like somebody else or do something like somebody else. And how we expand out from that. And this all comes back, Julie, to what I was dealing with in 1997 in South Africa. I was just going like, how do I get every one of these people from a non-English speaking background in South Africa to let this idea of speaking English in a certain way go? I mean, that's really where it begins for me. And it begins with people saying to me, oh, you need to stand up straight and pull your shoulders back to speak. But I grew up on a farm with Zulu speakers who didn't have to do that to speak, and they all had big voices. And when I got on a stage with them to start acting in 1995, I was the idiot who didn't have a voice. So all those teachings that were related to my cultural heritage, which actually were to do more with aesthetics and class acceptability than to do with the production of sound in my human animal, were really and truly the beginning of my journey away from the anglicization of voice into the animalization of voice in a sense, and to work out what my animal wants to do first, and then how to put, obviously, there are certain social occasions and situations in which we code shift. But if we code shift as a constant matter of behavior, rather than moment by moment, we're giving ourselves up before we begin to speak. And so that my advice to voice coaches is stop asking people to step away from themselves, ask them to step into themselves. And once they've stepped into themselves, then begin the journey of exploration outwards for whatever version, for whatever those needs are, if that actually needs to happen anyway. Because in many instances, I mean, once you read the book, if it's ever published, I don't believe, there are all sorts of things I don't believe in, like I don't believe in character. I don't, all those things that we shift are really, again, divisions between us and listener. And the less of those divisions that there are, the more chance there is of connection. And the more chance there is of connection, the more chance there is of rapport, ultimately. And isn't the greatest moment of any communication moment really about rapport? And so to me, it's just finding how to get two people in themselves to connect. And so my work is very much based around that.
Fantastic. Well, we have got probably about 5 minutes left now, so we're going to end this amazing interview with our lovely values jam game. So I'm going to shuffle the cards. You can just see that
Terrifies me.
So these are questions that you don't really have to think too much about. It's just the first answer that comes into your head, and it just gives our audience a little bit more insight into who you are. Yeah. So I've spread out the cards.
I answer Fortnum and Mason to everything.
Other brands are available. Yeah. I'm going to run my finger along the card. So if you just say stop, and I'll pull a card. All right, let's have a look. We have got, and it gets quite good for what we've got. We have got love. The love card, and it's quite a good one as well. Julie and I were just saying last time, we're picking really good cards. We're picking really good cards for the discussion, because a lot of what we've discussed today is about really sort of loving yourself and being in tune with your voice, your authentic self. And I think you can only do that when you love yourself and you embrace yourself. So Donald, what does love mean to you? What does it look, feel, and sound like?
Difficult question. Well, I'll just, my first answer is my mother's my best friend, and she's like the great heart love of my life. So love is really, and then after that, I've got a kind of group of friends that embrace me entirely as myself, that I'm completely comfortable around. So for me, love is really about being able to be, it is something we experience when surrounded by those that embrace and allow us to be ourselves entirely.
Absolutely. How could more love improve the world, do you think?
Well, in every single way possible. Literally, I think, I mean, I can only talk from a teaching point of view in this, like in terms of measuring as a single person with no children. For me, it's every time I go into a room, I treat every person in that room with love and respect, and like they deserve to be there as themselves. And if we could function in every environment like everybody there deserved to be there, obviously not if you're Hitler, but you know, it's like to just try to create that space for people to be allowed to express themselves. Love everybody, love, just, yeah, make everyone feel valued. Love makes people feel valued.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. And that really is all we have time for. So it just remains for me to say that we have loved having you on the couch with us today. It's been an absolute delight and a joy, and so thoroughly interesting. We will be putting all the details for Donald in the show notes, and you'll have seen it going across the screen as well. So please do connect with him if you are a voice coach and you would like to learn more about what Donald does, or whether you feel that you need some voice coaching.
Or a politician or anybody else, I'm here and I'm mobile now that COVID's over. I can be wherever you need me to be.
Absolutely, and that's a wonderful thing about Zoom, hasn't it? It's opened up the world, and we can connect and make those connections with people no matter where they are. So do please join us next time for our next episode on the couch. It has been wonderful to see you all. Thank you. Goodbye.